Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Brothers and sisters, in this video lecture, I'm going to go through the descriptive statistics measures, particularly on the topic of variability or dispersion. In the past lecture, we have discussed there are two ways of describing the data. The first one is measures of central tendency. And now, in this video lecture, we're going to focus on variability or dispersion. Measures of dispersions. In assessing the measures of dispersions, in this particular video lecture, we're going to focus on the analysis, which will include the range, interquartile range, as well as standard deviation. Let's put the whole analysis in the context. Say I have a friend and he's about to invest on one of the company, but he's not sure on which company he should go for. There's one company called MeNote, and another one is SafeBook. And he asked me, where should I invest? To help me find out which company is worth investing, he shared with me the profit of each company in the past 9 months. For MeNote, these are the list of profits in Ringgit Malaysia in thousand for the past 9 months. 88,000, 92,000, 91,000, 89,000, and so on. The same thing for SafeBook, he gave me the list of profit in the past 9 months. 71,000, 100,000, 72,000, 83,000, and so on. Then he asked me, how can we use this information? There are few ways in which we can actually use that information. First, let's have a look on how we can use the dispersion using the range. Range is the simplest measure of dispersion, and it shows how spread out our data is. In order to calculate the range, you subtract the smallest number from the largest number. Just like the mean, the range is very sensitive to outliers. The higher the range, it highlights the greater dispersions in our data. Let's have a look again on the profit of both companies in the past 9 months. From here, as we can see, the profit from MeNote, we can have a look that the highest profit is 92,000. Whereas for SafeBook, we can see that the highest is 100. Again, let's have a look at MeNote. The lowest is 88,000. Whereas for SafeBook, the lowest is 70,000. Remember, the formula for range is just a simple of subtractions, the highest minus the lowest. So in here, we can see that the highest is 92, minus by 88 is 4. Whereas the range for SafeBook, the highest is 100, minus by 70 is 30. Can this tell us something? Maybe, but it may not be enough. So let's have a look on other dispersion analysis. The next one is interquartile range, or IQR. Let me give you a hint that the lower IQR, the stronger the central tendency of the data set. But what is IQR? IQR actually gives a measure of the range within only the middle 50% of the data sets. So again, if we order the profit in the past 9 months for both companies, we can come up with this, okay, from the lowest to the highest. The same thing from the lowest to the highest. And how we can actually use the IQR. The IQR will look at the median and then the QR, the quartile 3, and this is the quartile 1. This is the quartile 2, and this is the quartile 3. The same thing. This is our Q1, Q2, and Q3. So how we can use these informations? in IQR, basically you want to subtract instead of maximum and minimum. We want to look at the quartile 3 minus by quartile 1. So we can find out it is 91 minus by 89. The IQR for me note is 2, whereas the IQR for safe book is 28. I'm very sure by now you already get the feelings on the dispersions. Let's have a look how we can do this in Excel. So I have listed all the profit for the past 5 months in each column. Let's implement the range first. So the range is basically the maximum value of the range here. It's very simple, minus by the minimum value of the range here. Okay, so we can get 4. The same thing, we're going to do the max for the safe book minus, okay, minus by the minimum of the safe book profits. We got 30 for the safe book on the range. And how do we implement quartile? Again, we want to look at the quartile 3. So in here, we're going to have quartile. Okay, we give the range. Comma. So it shows you which quartile is. We are interested on the third quartile. Okay, so quartile 3 minus by, let's have a look on another quartile, which is quartile 1. Let's give the range again. And first quartile. So the quartile for me note is 2. Okay, but we have to change the range obviously. The array for safe book is this one. And obviously we have to change this one as well. Okay, so the interquartile or IQR for the first one for me note is 2, whereas the IQR for safe book is 28. Perhaps by now it gives us some ideas on the dispersions, on the variabilities of these two companies. So since we are still just dealing with ranges, there are still unknowns in the data. To confidently compare these two data sets, we need to have a stronger measure. So just now we look at the range, we look at the IQR, and I'm very sure you have heard standard deviations. Just to compare these three techniques, standard deviations is considered as the strongest, whereas range and IQR, as compared to standard deviations, is weaker. Why is that so? Standard deviation is the most popular measure of dispersion. It provides an average distance of the dataset from the mean. The higher the standard deviations, the more spread out your data are. It is calculated by finding the square root of the variance. This is the formula of standard deviations. As you can see in here, to get the standard deviations, we will need the size of populations. We will also need the values of each data that we have in our data sets, as well as the population mean. What we can learn from standard deviations. A low standard deviations means that most of the numbers are very close to the average. A high standard deviations means that the numbers are spread out. Let's go back to the example. So in this case, again, we have the profit in the past 9 months from both companies. Based on the standard deviations, the first company or minnow company, the standard deviations is 1.25, whereas SafeBook, the standard deviations is 12.27. How do we calculate the standard deviation in Excel? To calculate the standard deviations, since that we have all values here instead of sample, we need to calculate using the standard deviations of the populations. The only difference, the standard deviations of populations and sample, is just on the n. On the sample, we have to minus by 1. But since that we are taking all data from our population, so we obviously will have to use the standard deviations of the populations, which is here. Okay. So the standard deviations for minute is the array of all profits for minute company, and the same thing that we're going to do for SafeBook profit. I'm very sure by now you already have the feelings on which company we're going to ask our friends to invest. Since that our friends are more inclined to something that is more predictable and avoid all risks as much as possible, we know which company would be suitable for him. Anyway, some useful conclusions that can be made by observing the standard deviations. First, by looking at the standard deviations, we would be able to know whether there are any outliers. And it also helps us to calculate the z-scores. And since it gives differentiable functions, it can also be used for further optimizations. Standard deviation is also useful in finding out empirical formula for normal distributions. And standard deviations tells you a great deal about how spread out your samples are and the number of samples you can expect at the various distance from the mean. Remember that we also have empirical rule. The dispersions of data, if it's normally distributed, we can actually implement the 68, 95, 99.7 rule. 68% of the data fits within one standard deviations of the mean. 95% of the data fall within 2 standard deviations of the means, whereas 99.7% will fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean. The empirical rule will only apply if the data that we have normally distributed or usually presented in bell curve shape. Okay, so I'm very sure by now you would be able to answer our friend's questions, right? So if he asks us, where should I invest? Now we know that Minute would be the best company to invest. Things to note: if the data set is non-normal, then standard deviations is a lot less useful for most of the time. However, there is still Chebyshev's inequality theorem, which can give you some potentially useful bounds that apply even to non-normal distributions. We're going to look at the Chebyshev theorem in the next video. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, or otherwise you can also refer on the references that I have here. All the best and happy learning. Assalamualaikum.